War. Since the early days of mankind, war has ravaged across the globe. In the name of good or evil, to attack or defend, war has created empires and destroyed nations. Since the time of Alexander the Great, results on the battlefield had much to do with the great generals who led their armies to victory or followed them into exile. A great military mind was able to see an opportunity where others saw only a lost cause. A great general was able to develop a plan of attack that could outwit an opponent or respond to an offensive action with speed and agility. In the 20th century came the greatest war the world had ever known. A war between many nations that pitted modern armor, aircraft, and weaponry on a scale unimaginable by the armies of old. World War II. In this war, many were called to greatness. Leaders emerged from small country towns and large urban areas. No nation was more blessed with military leaders than the United States of America. Generals who rose from the ranks to lead their troops to battle. Men who were born to greatness, and men who had greatness thrust upon them. This is their story. The famous generals of World War II. They were legends in their own time and remain so today. Their lives were an inspiration, and their deeds the stuff of history. Here now is the story of Joseph W. Stilwell. Joseph W. Stilwell had already spent many years in the service of his country when he was called upon to go through an ordeal that was both physically exhausting. But he carried on, where younger and seemingly stronger men were by the wayside. Although his bluntness of speech earned him the nickname of Vinegar Joe, to the millions of men who served under him, he was the kindest and most modest man who ever lived. To all of them, he was, and in memory still remains, Uncle Joe. Joseph Stilwell was born in March of 1883 in Palatka, Florida. His childhood and early youth, however, were to be spent in Yonkers, New York. Even in earliest years, in appearance and in character, he was typically American, and so the decision to send Joe Stilwell to the military academy at West Point. The year was 1900, and the decision was a fortunate one. Few men could know that young men with qualities of courage and leadership would be needed to serve the United States through ensuing years of crisis. Between the lines of the yellowed class yearbook, one can read hints of those qualities. For the young quarterback, they were already winning a permanent niche among West Point's football immortals. They were destined to serve him on fields broader than the gridiron. Graduation from the academy did not end Joseph Stilwell's association with West Point. The newly commissioned second lieutenant of infantry was to spend 11 of the next 14 years teaching a succession of classes. His field instruction, foreign languages. A natural aptitude in these subjects was to prove as fortunate for the U.S. as was the decision to make the military his profession. In the crowded years not spent at the academy, there would be an assignment to serve at schools and at tours of duty in the Philippines and at home. Meanwhile, history was setting the stage for the first of our century's major crises, World War I. In its flames, untried American leadership would be tested and tempered. Joseph Stilwell would be among those who received their baptism of fire. Over there was the patriotic song of the hour. Over there sailed young American manhood to fight in the first international conflict of our history. With the temporary rank of Major, Joseph Stilwell disembarked in France during the bleak, disheartening December of 1917. There followed a brief period of service with the British Division. Then, with his fluency in French, he became liaison officer with the French 17th Corps. For the young major, there was action at Verdun, Le Fère, Toul, Saint-Mihiel. For his service in this last engagement, Stillwell, now Assistant Chief of Staff, 4th Army Corps, received the Distinguished Service Medal. For military attainments of a high order, read the citation. With the war's end, it was now Colonel Stillwell who went on to serve with the Army of Occupation within Germany. There he remained until July of 1919. By now, the enthusiastic scenes welcoming American troops back to civilian life were past history. For a returned professional soldier, there would be no termination of service. In full recognition of his talent for language, Joseph Stilwell's next assignment of duty was to take him to Beijing, there to study and attain fluency in the many Chinese dialects. With him went his wife and their 3 children. 2 more would be born during the years in China. The comfortable Stillwell home came to reflect his growing appreciation of Oriental art. It was to earn him recognition as a connoisseur. To the Chinese people around him, the perceptive Stillwell brought his own humane understanding. Out of it came mutual respect and warm regard. One day in the future, these would help forge military victory. But before that day, there were to be years of service for Joseph Stillwell. Now, he must return to the United States. Beside him at Fort Benning's Infantry Training School, fellow future general officers taught and studied. George C. Marshall, Omar Bradley, men who were to become great generals in a future war. At Fort Leavenworth's Command and General Staff School, there were additional years of study. Then, once again, it was back to China, this time as military attaché to the United States Embassy in Beijing. Here he remained as the clash of conflicting interests between Japan and the awakening giant China led inevitably to incident, and incident to all-out war. The incident was Manchuria. The military machine of the Japanese required no organizing. For the military clique which then held power had long anticipated this day. The overall plan was to decimate China, reduce her province by province. Japan's modern air force would meanwhile be destroying China's sources of power to resist. The Chinese proved no defense against the perfected military efficiency of the Japanese. On hand, as American observer, was Colonel Joseph Stillwell. It became his growing and unshakable conviction that the Chinese soldier was a first-class fighting man, needing only first-class equipment, first-class leadership. Chiang Kai-shek, at that time thought to be the one leader able to preserve Chinese unity, was by now forced to withdraw to the interior city of Chongqing. From here, he sought endlessly to enlist the aid of other nations. There had already occurred the Panay incident, in which an American ship in Chinese waters had been sunk by Japanese bombers. This had crystallized the American sentiment that had long inclined to sympathy for China. Aid had come as young Americans volunteered their services. Acting unofficially as private citizens, one such group, the Flying Tigers, were winning fame as they took an impressive toll of Japanese planes. As China's armies engaged in their unequaled struggle, arms and equipment were now made available. To cut off these sources of material aid, Japan systematically occupied or blockaded one after another of China's port cities. In effect, Japan built a wall around China. Deprived of needed supply from without, a weakened China would be vulnerable to the heavy blows of the invading forces. The former American observer Stillwell, now back home again, serving at California's Presidio. A major general, he commanded the 3rd Army Corps. Step by step, history was setting the stage for its climactic tragedy. Out of that tragedy, Joseph Stilwell would emerge to play a heroic role. From a country stunned by disaster, General Stillwell was sent to China, there to serve as chief of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's Allied staff, and with a small American staff to take nominal command of China's 5th and 6th armies. The new responsibility brought him his 3rd star. In the absence of clear-cut Allied command lines, General Stilwell's first job was to help in the defense of Burma. Burma offered the only route by which material aid could be fed into China. China must be built up, made stronger and stronger until her allies could join her in going over to the offensive. That would be a far-off day, for President Roosevelt gave priority to the European theater of war. To build up China, supplies were trucked in over the newly built Burma Road. The Burma Road was started by the Chinese after the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. According to one eyewitness, it was scratched out of the mountains with fingernails. For months, some 200,000 labored, and many died so that blockaded China could fight on. Late in 1939, the road was completed, following the ancient trade route used in the Middle Ages by caravans bearing silk and jade, amber and ivory. Now that route was to be traveled by caravans of guns and fuel, ammunition and food, across the land bridge of Burma to China. To keep that country alive in its struggle with Japan, just as Russia had been kept alive in its battle against Germany by the land bridge of Iran. The Nazis tried to destroy that lifeline, but it was saved by the British victory at El Alamein and by the Russians at Stalingrad. China was not as fortunate. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese struck at the land bridge of Burma. A defeated China would mean India invaded, and increased pressure on General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific. The invasion started in January 1942. Both on the ground and in the air, the Japanese had overwhelming superiority. On the Allied side, General Alexander headed small forces of British, Indians, and Burmese, and General Stilwell commanded Chinese troops sent by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The Japanese sought to cut off China's supply line from Rangoon to Mandalay, the Burma Road, running from Lashio to Kunming. They struck from Thailand toward the vital port of Rangoon. General Claire Chennault and his American volunteer group of Flying Tigers, together with small units of the RAF, helped to ward off the offensive. The Japanese attacked Rangoon in force. Rangoon fell. The enemy swept on to central Burma along the road to Mandalay, where, by air and ground, with the aid of 5th columnists and looters, they destroyed that city. The Burma which was to know Stillwell's exploits had become a battle scene. General Stilwell and his Chinese, together with outnumbered British, Free French, and Dutch troops, fought on. But the effort was doomed. The Japanese steamroller pushed on. It had administered humiliating defeats to the Allies in the Pacific and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. It had taken over thousands of square miles, together with peoples and resources. Now it rolled across Burma. India's borders lay open to attack. Worst of all, that last vital land route, the Burma Road, lay useless. Once again, the old lesson must be learned. Courage alone is not enough. For the Allies, withdrawal became retreat. Retreat, a nightmare route. The Burma Road was cut. Thousands of refugees choked the roads as Alexander and Stillwell were forced to retreat with what was left of their armies. The last to leave were the demolition squads that scorched the earth, destroyed equipment, put fire to oil supplies. As the Allies retreated, they were joined by an ever-growing mass of refugees, Burmese whose homes and lives had been shattered. The Allies did what they could for these refugees, and through brilliant leadership and individual fortitude, managed to keep ahead of the Japanese. They retreated along elephant trails, through jungle, across rivers and mountains, to the safety of India. In the ordeal, Joseph Stilwell's full stature revealed itself. Refusing the comforts his age and rank might have claimed, he personally conducted a group of 400 battered troops, Burmese nurses, and civilians to the safety of India. There, at New Delhi, he was to utter the now classic admission of defeat and announce his determination to go back and wipe it out. There was the honesty, correctness, the tough moral fiber that characterized the man.
I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
The battered campaign hat and shirt sleeves now became a familiar sight as the job of regrouping and training began. Burma covers approximately the same area as Texas. On its western border lies India. On its east, China, Indochina, and Thailand. To many, Burma is a land of legend, a shrine of Buddhism with its pagodas, its fabled road to Mandalay, its colorful cities and villages, its strange and picturesque people. To the Allies, however, who were to fight there, Burma was a land of perpetual struggle against nature, with jungles so thick whole armies can pass within a short distance of one another without detection. Wide and turbulent rivers that are almost impassable. Mountain barriers reaching their greatest height in the Himalayas, highest range in the world. It's a land of extreme climate, intense cold, heat, and monsoons. Rain as great as anywhere on Earth. Its swamps are breeding grounds for malarial mosquitoes, cholera, beriberi, typhus, dysentery. Tropical fevers and sores plague its inhabitants. This was the land where Stillwell and the Allies had to fight. The task of reopening the land bridge of Burma was a tremendous one. General Stilwell's first act after the Japanese invasion was the formation of an American command known as CBI, China, Burma, India. From China came thousands of Chinese. They were carried over the Himalayas by planes of the American Air Force to Ramgarh in India. Here, under CBI, a huge training station had been started. On the British side, the Commander-in-Chief of India Command was Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wynne, later to become Viceroy and to be succeeded in his military leadership by General Sir Claude Auchinleck. On the shoulders of these men fell the responsibility of raising and training huge armies for the defense of India. It wasn't long before India became a vast armed camp. From the independent kingdom of Nepal came the Gurkhas. From the Naga hills, Naga headhunters joined forces with the Allies. From East Africa and West Africa came more troops. From Burma came the Burma Rifles, and from the Chin Hills, Chin and Kachin tribesmen. Scots, Irish, English, Welsh, Australian, New Zealander, Indian, Gurkha, Burmese, African, Chinese, American. Never was there such a diverse army. In the meantime, in China, roads packed with refugees gave evidence of the terrific struggle against the Japanese advance. There were attempts to push through other trails. Mule packs were driven over the Himalayas to China at freezing altitudes. But the cargo they could carry was pitifully small, and the time it took incredibly long. The first step was the construction of an air bridge, across which supplies were to be flown by the pilots of the American Transport Command, shuttling back and forth over what they called the hump. It was a slow process. Equipment had to be taken apart so it could be loaded aboard planes. It was flown across Burma, over the Himalayas, to Kunming in China. Enemy interception, particularly from the important airbase at Mishinau, denied them a direct line and forced them north over a much higher route. They flew across jungles, through mist and fog, over mountains often at altitudes of over 20,000 feet. The menace of Japanese planes was ever present. They made a sky bridge 525 miles long over the roof of the world and carried across in unarmed transport planes the vital supplies needed by the American and Chinese air forces and the Chinese armies. But it wasn't enough. There was still desperate need for a land bridge. So at the end of 1942, the monument to Joseph Stilwell's ingenuity and drive was begun, the Lido Road. Starting at Lido in northern India, the plan was to drive through jungles, rivers, mountains, and Japanese opposition to a juncture with the Burma Road. A supply route was then forged from Calcutta to Lido by rail across the Lido-Burma Road to Kunming, and thence to Chongqing in China. Burma's mountains, rivers, railways, and highways extend from north to south. To push through this new road, the Allies would have to fight against the grain from west to east. The Lido Road was begun by a handful of men facing a task that had been called impossible. And so, with inadequate machinery and tools, a few American engineering units with a detachment of Chinese engineers and what Asiatic labor could be had started one of the greatest road-building jobs in history. Again and again, they saw their work collapse as the monsoon washed away whole stretches, but the road inched along. Modern machinery and trained manpower could clear up the Indian end of the projected loop. At the China end, it was a far different story. Here, it must be back-breaking manual labor with primitive tools. Men, women, and even children threw themselves into the Herculean task. China knew what was at stake, and China responded. At the docks in Calcutta, second largest city of the British Empire, supplies from America and Great Britain and the factories of India were piling up, waiting to be hauled to the Lido Road and the hump. Some of the supplies were sent by water in primitive flat boats and barges. Almost as cumbersome a route was the Bengal-Assam Railway. It took a circuitous road, making long detours to outlying tea plantations, switching 3 times to different gauge rails over a roadbed that had to be constantly repaired as a result of the monsoon. The fastest method was by cargo plane from Calcutta, but as yet there were too few planes available for this purpose. During this time, there was a secret expedition that came to light when a small group of worn and haggard men emerged from the Burmese jungle. They were called the Chindees. Their name was taken from the Burmese name for a legendary animal that symbolized protection. Almost as legendary was their leader, Brigadier, later Major General Charles Ward Wingate, professional soldier, pioneer jungle fighter. In the beginning of 1943, with complete secrecy, he had led British and Indian troops behind enemy lines into the heart of Burma, across the Chindwin River to the Irrawaddy, a distance of 200 miles, on foot. About this time, the first Quebec Conference took place between Roosevelt, Churchill, and the American and British Chiefs of Staff. Here, new plans were evolved for the war against Japan. A new command was formed, Southeast Asia Command, combining the British and American operations. The appointment of Supreme Allied Commander went to Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, former Chief of Combined Operations in Britain and leader of the Commandos. General Stillwell was appointed Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, in addition to his duties as Chief of Staff in China and head of CBI. Back in Southeast Asia, Mountbatten set up his Allied headquarters, choosing as its emblem the phoenix, the symbolic bird that emerged from the ashes of a destroying fire. Meanwhile, on the Lido Road, construction was progressing. Colonel, later to become Major General Lewis A. Pick, in command of the engineers. "The Lido Road is going to be built," said Pick. "Mud and rain and malaria be damned." The increase in material aid was making greater demands upon air transport. Suddenly, the hitherto ignored operation captured the imagination of the outside world. Flying over the hump became a familiar phrase. Behind the phrase lay the reality of every type of plane available, many lacking modern instruments, flying back and forth in unpredictable weather, their route over uncharted and treacherous mountains. The stockpile for this, seemingly the sideshow of the war effort, was mounting. The tools of battle were now ready and waiting to help settle an old score. The Asian theater had been remembered. Air power opened a prelude to attack. And to sustain it, fighters and bombers of the newest types arrived in increasing numbers. Soon, the prelude to attack was no longer a curtain raiser, but the first stage of fiery assault. The day had come. Men from China, from all parts of the British Commonwealth, from India and Burma, and from far-off Africa. Men of many races, many tongues were on the march, and with General Stilwell's diverse army, a growing number of American units. Among them were General Merrill's troops, experienced fighters from the Pacific. Merrill's Marauders was to be their popular name, as they helped make history. As the bulldozers and tractors cleared away obstructions, Chinese infantry and artillery, trained by the American Army in Rangar, India, moved ahead to clear enemy opposition. Along this route, another great engineering project was starting, a fuel pipeline from India across Burma to China. Over 2,000 miles of pipe was laid, a huge artery across the savage terrain, to carry a transfusion of gasoline, diesel oil, and lubricating oil, each in its turn for the trucks and tanks, the machines, and the planes that were fighting in China. In 2 years of preparation, General Stillwell had molded a machine to beat the enemy at his own game, mountain and jungle warfare. Man-made weapons would exact casualties, but losses even heavier were inflicted by malaria, dysentery, hepatitis, and a wide range of tropical diseases. For the men who fought, Japanese metal could hit as hard, sickness could be as crippling as in any other theater. For them, Burma was no sideshow. Another problem was the treatment of casualties from enemy gunfire. Wounded men were sometimes carried miles by foot, by raft, mule, jeep, truck, ox cart. One of the great heroes of this campaign was Colonel Gordon Seagrave, formerly an American medical missionary who was with Stillwell on his retreat from Burma and went back to that country with a group of nurses of various native races and a series of mobile hospital units. Seagrave and his men and women performed operations under the most primitive conditions. The conquest of disease made huge strides. Now, the conquest of the Japanese had to keep pace. More and more Chinese were being trained at Rangar in India and at Kunming in China. These were to become part of the forces that were to strike at the enemy from the China-Burma border across the Salween River. In northern India, the Chinese-American composite wing had been organized by Major General Claire Chennault for the Generalissimo. A picked group of American volunteers was instructing Chinese pilots and crews to fly the latest type of planes. Cargo planes shuttled back and forth over the hump to China. Advanced troops in the Lido Road Drive were supplied in the air by the Troop Carrier Command. Supplies were carefully packed according to weight, size, and breakability. Then they were loaded on planes with parachutes attached. Now, to find the men hidden in the jungles who needed these supplies. In twisting mile-deep canyons and jungle-covered terrain, a miss by a few yards could be as bad as missing by a few hundred miles. The Allied Air Force of British and Americans in the newly formed Eastern Air Command bombed and strafed Japanese strongholds. In India and in China, huge air bases were being built for a new and powerful weapon, the B-29 Super Fortress. Thousands of Asiatic laborers, men, women, and children, used whatever tools they could find, no matter how primitive. Seemingly everywhere was lean, raw-boned Uncle Joe, as he was referred to generally. Bluntness had also earned him the title Vinegar Joe. Doubtless there were saltier names coined in the ranks. General Stilwell would not have cared what they called him, as long as they did their job. Stillwell was truly a soldier's soldier. He shared the hardships and dangers of his men and gave the phrase real meaning. Stillwell had the unique capacity for commanding respect and obedience while evoking a genuine affection. Perhaps no group regarded the general and the man with warmer feelings than did the Chinese troops in his command. It was no secret that General Su, as he was called, consistently extolled their courage and promoted their welfare, often in the face of adverse opinion from above. Repaying that faith now were unbroken Chinese victories in the field. Elsewhere in southern Burma, names like the Salween and Irrawaddy rivers were back in the news. But now, these were scenes of successes. It was the enemy who yielded, as British-led Allied forces reclaimed more and more of Burma's soil. North and south, it was the same story. An old humiliation was erased. It was now 2 years since the retreat from Burma, and the 61-year-old general could see his timetable for victory working out on schedule. Under the circumstances, a birthday celebration was a pleasant and well-earned respite. The presence of a son, Colonel Joseph Stillwell, Jr., marked it a family occasion as well. But however welcome, such respites must be few and far between. The forgotten war in both South and North had reached its climax. The Japanese knew well that each mile of ground lost in northern Burma meant another mile added to the link between India and China. The Lido Road was growing. On the heels of combat troops, often under Japanese harassment, came the men who must hack out that road. The land itself fought back. Jungle growth would completely reclaim and obliterate in 2 weeks' time the work that neither the Japanese nor disease nor climate would halt. Against the Japanese, there was the rifle always close by. To fight the soil, every weapon from the axe to explosive charge was employed. The work went on. General Joseph Stilwell was almost literally dragging his road behind him. Yet, as he pushed on, and the Japanese grudgingly yielded, the mule trail became a road. In relative safety, engineering could expand the road into a solid truck route. As it neared completion, the derisive phrase, "impossible road," was heard less often. Across jungle-covered plateaus it stretched, across rivers untamed since the creation, yet now they have been harnessed and bridged. Across mountain ranges it traveled to narrow the gap between India and China. Then inevitably came the great day, the day when a first convoy could move along its 1,044-mile length. The enemy had been pushed out of northeast Burma, and the way lay clear. Considering the difficulties and the hardships that had been borne in shaping its tortuous route, it was truly a military miracle that it was built. The Lido Road was now a reality. The first convoy rolled into Kunming, a token of the supply flow to follow. Honoring the man who had weathered all opposition to build the route, it was renamed the Stillwell Road. 4 months later, Allied command could announce victory in Burma. What of the man who had built the road and forged that victory? The tides and cross-currents of events had taken him far from what would have been his hour of triumph. Receiving his 4th star, General Stillwell came home to serve as commander of ground forces. Then, after the Pacific, for a tour of battlefronts and installations. In the course of those next months, he became commander of the 10th Army. Later, he was to serve as commanding general at Okinawa. But wherever the assignment, the Stillwell story remained unchanged. He was still blunt, unassuming Uncle Joe. The general with no patience for pomposity and pretense. He was still the gaunt, typical American who somehow reminded of the symbolic figure, Uncle Sam. More important, he was still the Joseph Stillwell with an understanding of the men in the ranks and a talent for winning their affection. It was, of course, his own feelings being reflected, as warm feelings always are. Summer of 1945 was ending, and so too World War II. Like MacArthur, who had vowed to return to the scene of an earlier defeat and erase its humiliation, General Stillwell would welcome the date September the 2nd. Aboard the battleship Missouri, on that day, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur submitted the formal surrender terms to a defeated enemy. An end had come to the agonies of a tortured world. Peace had come, in victory and with honor. Once again for General Stilwell, there was assignment to the Presidio, but now as a prelude to well-earned retirement. At nearby Carmel was his family and the home he loved. Here he had planned to pass the rich remaining years that lay ahead. But that was not to be. On October 12th, 1946, after a short illness, stout-hearted Joseph Stillwell died. By his own instructions, any pompous ceremony was omitted. His ashes were strewn out on the Pacific, in an area he knew well and loved. At West Point, one can still find Stillwell's old campaign hat and combat boots. There hangs, too, a portrait that pays tribute to Joseph W. Stillwell's career of service to his country, to the men he led, and to the example of leadership that he gave America. He was, indeed, one of the great generals of World War II.